Hi, welcome to Prof E Plays. I'm Prof E, and I'm just sitting here in my bedroom thinking about the age-old question, like, are D20 systems swingy? Because you'll occasionally hear this. I was actually inspired by Dice Tales, right, who recently had a video about this, making the case that D20 systems are not, in fact, swingy. I'm actually going to make an overlapping case, but we would definitely make our case different directions, or from different directions, rather, even if we reach similar conclusions. So let's go and get into it. And so here's the basic claim. Right, so the basic claim is that a D20, that's the 20-sided die you would typically use in, say, the most popular role-playing game, and also many similar role-playing games. So, like, say on my channel, Shadow Dark is the one that I play. That's a D20-based system, right? So you roll that 20-sided die, add your modifier compared to a target number. It's a very standard way to play these games, right? So the D20 has this reputation of being swingy, and the argument is simply this. That is, every outcome on that die, right, from the most average, which would be like a 10 or an 11, right, to the most extreme, 1 or 20, has the same probability. So what's the probability of rolling an 8, which is just slightly below average? 5%. What's the probability of getting the best possible outcome, rolling a 20? 5%. What's the probability of getting an 11, which is basically average? 5%. Right? So every single one of these possible outcomes of the 20 that are out there, right, has a 5% probability. So this feels like it has a whole lot of swing in it, as opposed to, say, a dice pool system like you might find in, say, some of the I think Forbidden Lands, if I remember right, does a dice pool system. Or also the one that I'm more familiar with would be like old White Wolf games with the World of Darkness. That was a dice pool based system. Or there's also dice curve systems where, say, you're rolling multiple dice and then adding them together, right? So something like Traveler, or and on my channel I do Cepheus, the 2d6 systems. You roll 2d6, you add them together, that total. Right? That's going to be less swingy by the standard, because if you roll 2d6, say, right, the odds of you getting a 7, which is exactly in the middle of the distribution, are much higher, in fact, about 6 times as high as rolling a 1, a 2. Actually, you can't roll a 1, so a 2. So a total of 2, you have a 1 in 36 chance. A total of uh, 7, you have a 6 in 36 chance. Right, so those extremes are much less likely than the average. So these dice curve type systems where there's a probability distribution that looks kind of bell curve like tends to push you more toward the middle where the average is. Okay, so that's not very swingy. You don't see the extremes as likely as the middle is the claim. So some statistics related to this, because in my real job, I am actually a professor. I mostly teach economics, but also teach some statistics, specifically business statistics, analytics kind of stuff. Right, so one way we can measure swinginess is what we call the coefficient of variation. So the coefficient of variation, you take the standard deviation, which is a measure of kind of how much variation you see within a probability distribution or a sample, right? And then you divide that by the mean, what we would typically call the average, right? So this way we're adjusting for the fact that when you roll 2d6, the average is about a 7. When you roll a d20, the average is 10 and a half, right? So you don't want to just use the standard deviation itself because that's sensitive to the units. So this way the units get canceled out is the idea. Right, so if you have something where you regularly roll high, you might have more span in terms of units, but that's just because you're rolling with bigger numbers, right? Right. So when you calculate the standard deviation over the mean, what we call the coefficient of variation, for a d20, assuming it's a fair die, this comes to about 55%. So the standard deviation is 55% as large as the mean. With a 2d6, it's about 34.5%. Right, so this suggests that in the d20, we do see more swing or more variation, right, around the mean than we see when we roll 2d6. Right, so d20, it's swingier, right? QED, right? Quote est demonstratum. Right? My Latin is horrific. That's the proof. We're done. Except I've already hinted that I don't think the d20 is swingier. So let's get into that. The key, right, to this argument, right, is they make this assumption that each numerical outcome on that d20 gives a different result. That is, we know, right, a 1 is awful, a 20 is awesome, right? So as you move from the 1 to the 20, right, things are getting gradually better. A 2 is slightly better than 1, a 3 is slightly better than 2, a 4 is slightly better than 3, and so on, right? So you actually have 20 different possible outcomes, not just in terms of the number on the die, but in terms of the result in the game. And that's where the swinginess comes from, right? Is that we have all these different results, all of these different results are equally likely, right? So then that is really a key point in this. Right? After all, if it turns out that rolling a 3 and a 4 actually give the same result, right, then it really doesn't matter which of those you're rolling. You actually have just a higher probability of getting that result. Ah, and that's the trick. All right, so what if it isn't? Right? The fact is, most of the time, when you look at standard D20 systems, you typically have only four outcomes that are available. One is a critical failure. This is if you roll a natural one. So 5% chance of that happening. Right? Another would be the opposite of that, a critical success, where you roll a natural 20. Right? Then outside of those extremes, you have two other possibilities. That is, a regular failure or a regular success. So regular failure, you rolled under whatever your target number is you're trying to hit, but you didn't get a natural one, you got better than that. Right? Regular success, you roll at or over the target number, but not a natural 20. Now, I would say not every system has this. Actually, if you go and you read, I would recommend doing this. If you go and you read, I only have the 2014 5e books, but I just flipped through them, and they actually establish that outside of combat, there are two outcomes, failure and success, all based on comparing to a target number. Inside of combat, there are also the natural one outcome, but the one outcome they don't call a critical failure. It's just an automatic failure, right? So it's just that there's always a 5% chance of failing in combat, no matter how good you are. And the critical success, that'd be a critical hit. So that does actually give you a different outcome than standard failure or standard success. Right. Or like if you look at, I'm going to talk about Shadow Dark later, it does actually use this four outcome system, right? You have a natural one, a natural 20. Natural one is the worst possible outcome within reason. 20 is the best possible outcome within reason. Apart from that, it's failure or success, is it? Which means then, right, typically a 2 is not actually worse than a 3. 2 and a 3 both give you regular failure. That's it. Which means regular failure, you roll a 2, you roll a 3, you get the same outcome, it has higher probability. Which means immediately, if 2 and 3 give you regular failure, a 1 gives you a critical failure, suddenly what is more average, right, is more likely than what is more extreme. All right, so let's get a little bit deeper into this. Right, so here I'm looking at the distribution of these four possible outcomes. So I'm looking at two different systems. So one would be an unmodified D20 roll. Your target is a 10. So you're trying to roll 10 or higher. If you roll a natural one, it's considered a critical failure. 5% chance of that happening. If you roll less than 10, so you roll anything from 2 to 9, that's just a regular failure. Well, there are 8 numbers to make that happen, 40% probability of that happening. Then there's the regular success, where you get a 10 or better, but you don't get a 20. 20 is a critical success, right? So anything from 10 to 19, there are 10 numbers in that range, including the 10 and the 19. So it's 50% chance of that happening. And the critical success is just one number on the die, 5% chance of that happening. Now let's think about an unmodified 2d6 roll, where you have a target of 7. What does that look like? Well, critical failure, we're going to say, well, that's the natural 2. It's the worst possible outcome. You roll 2 dice, add them together, they're both 1s, you got a 2. Right? There's a 2.8% chance of that happening. It's 1 in 36, just converted to a, a percentage. Same thing with critical success. You roll a 6 and a 6, add them together, you get 12. Right? 2.6% chance of that happening. Now, away from those, so both of those extremes are slightly less likely in the 2d6 system than in the d20 system. What about regular failure and regular success? Right, so regular failure, you have a basically 39% chance of hitting. So that'd be if you roll a 3, 4, 5, or 6. Add up the probabilities of all those things, it's just under 40%. Meanwhile, a regular success happens if you roll a 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11. Right, so about a 55% chance of that happening. So when you look at these two distributions, one thing I want to point out, they're really, really close. There isn't actually a lot of difference between these, right? So if what we're really doing, right, is thinking in terms of, do I have failure? Do I have success? And is it a critical of that type? if we just think about these four different possible outcomes, as opposed to in the D20 case, 20 possible outcomes, or the 2D6 case, it's what, like 11, yeah, 11 possible outcomes. As long as we're consolidating them, right, to failure, success, critical, or not, there's only four possible outcomes in either case. And the probabilities are really, really close. Now, it is true, you're slightly less likely to hit the extremes with the 2D6 than with the D20, but it's not a huge difference. It's the difference between 5% and about 3%, right? So it's not enormous. Now about the effect of a modifier. Now, this is where I think you can actually make the case, right, that the 2D6 in particular, right, is actually swingier in the sense that it is more sensitive to modifiers than a D20 is. Right, so here's what happens. So let's say you have, say you're playing, say Cepheus, and you're trying to roll a target number of 7, which you normally don't with Cepheus, but let's just say you are, and you have a +1 modifier because you have some skill that's relevant. Right, so in that case, what happens? So I have here the change in probability. Right, so your critical failure stays the same. Now, technically, in the Cepheus or Traveler system, it would actually vanish because you have to fail by at least 5, and if you're adding 1, you can't fail by at least 5, right? But let's just say that it stays the same. So the extreme stays the same, 2.8%, right? Same thing on the critical success side. Now, within the failure and success, what happens, right? Your 38.9% chance of failure falls to 25%. Your success percentage goes from 55.6% up to 39.4%. So really what we've done is taken that roll of 6, right, which has a probability of about 13% or so, between 13 and 14%. Right? You take that and you're adding it to success side, subtracting it from the failure side. That's all that's happening. And that gives you this huge swing of about 15 percentage points from failure to success. And that it's been pushed that direction. Now that means then a +1 modifier in a 2D6 system, like you get with Cepheus or Traveler, is equivalent to get that same 15% or so swing. You'd have to have a +3 modifier in the D20 system. Right, so if you want to have your modifiers having smaller effects, the D20 system actually allows you to fine tune much better. So the swing that comes from the modifier is way smaller. Right? And you can see the statistics here. They're shockingly similar to each other if you have a +3 modifier on a D20 or +1 modifier on a 2D6. All right, so just there's a different way of thinking about what we mean by swinginess. That's the idea. Now, I just want to do a quick analysis of Shadow Dark. Right, so after all, where does swinginess possibly come from? Right, so swinginess can come in if each individual number on the die does create a different outcome. So, like I said, I play Shadow Dark. Actually, I have the book right here. I did not intend to have it next to me, but it is in fact laying on my bed because I will often read here. Okay, so when you look at Shadow Dark, there are certain roles that are not swingy. Right, so roles in character creation definitely not swingy. Those, you're either rolling a 3d6 for your stats, so things like dex, strength, and the like, or you're rolling a 2d6, right, for the talents that you get related to your class, right? So those we have, it's not a dice pool, we have that probability curve kind of system, right? So definitely not swinging. They are pushing you toward average results. Much more strongly for the stats than for the talents. Success and failure for checks. Here, the reason it's not swingy again is because we're rolling against a specific target number. So there aren't actually 20 different outcomes. There are basically 2, technically 4 different outcomes. So we're just grouping together a bunch of possible rolls. Right? Similarly, hit or miss for combat. Again, it's against a target number. In this case, the target varies depending on what you're attacking, because it depends what the armor class is, but nonetheless, it's the same principle. You're rolling against a target number. You either succeed and hit, right? You succeed really well and hit with a critical success, right? Or you fail, right? And that's it. And you could technically say, well, okay, there's the critical failure as well that's possible, but again, just 4 outcomes. Right? There isn't going to be a lot of swinginess there between them, because most of the time you're either just going to plain hit or you're just going to plain miss. That's it. Then opposed rolls. Now you might say, oh, now opposed rolls are swingy because the higher I roll, that makes it harder for the other person to succeed. Now, on the face of it, it feels like that's true. When you boil it back down to the statistics, that's not actually what's happening. Instead, what's happening is you're each effectively rolling against a random target number. Right? So again, right, it's not that, oh, the higher I roll, the better I do. No, it's just the higher I roll, the more likely I am to succeed. Right? So again, we're bunching all those results into either success or failure. Now, whether I succeed, the odds of that are harder to predict because you're rolling against the other die. But nonetheless, the result is the same. It's either success or failure, right? So because again, we're bunching together the results from a bunch of different rolls, it's not going to be that swingy in terms of the result. Now, there are a couple rolls that we can say are swingy. One of those would be damage rolls. So in Shadow Dark, damage rolls, typically, you're going to be rolling a single die, especially if, say, you just have, say, a standard weapon, so something like, I don't know, crossbow or whatever. But then you're rolling just one die, and in this case, every single value on that die gives you a different result, right? So either you do 1 point of damage, or 2 points of damage, or 3 points of damage, and so on, right? However, you could say, no, wait a minute, it, is that really swingy? Because in the end, there are really only two outcomes, right? Either the target survives the damage they take, or they don't. It's not like if I attack you and do 3 points of damage, like you've taken an injury and you don't fight as well or something like that. No, if you're still up, you're still up, right? And typically, right, for me to take uh, another, say, creature or monster out, it's going to take more than one hit. But that means it's not one roll it's determining, it's multiple rolls together. So we're back on a probability distribution. Right. So we can actually think of damage rolls instead of thinking of it as, say, the individual rolls, we can think about the probability distribution for how many rolls is it probably going to take for me to take the thing out. And that one, again, there's a probability distribution. It is not perfectly flat like you would claim a D20 roll or any single die roll would be. And so I think you can make that argument actually either way. Right. So it's true for an individual die roll. If you think that each individual point of damage matters, then okay. Another thing, and I think the best argument for something that is swingy in the Shadow Dark system is the way that death works in that system, where you roll a d4 and then add your Constitution modifier to it, and then you have that many rounds until you die. And each of those rounds you can make a death save, where if you succeed on the death save, roll a 20, then you recover uh, with 1 hit point, or right, somebody can come and try to heal you in that time. So in this case, it is true, right? Say if I have a Constitution modifier of 0, just to make life easy, right, a 2 is in fact better than a 1 because it gives my allies two chances, 2 rounds to try to get to me and save me. It also gives me 2 chances to save myself, right, through death saves, right, and the like, right? So similarly, then moving from a 2 to a 3, that does actually make a qualitative difference in that it gives me another chance to do a death save, or gives my allies another chance to get a healing potion down my throat, right? So I think death timers are the best case in that game where there is actually a swinginess. But you know what? I don't think that's necessarily a problem. Right? Some things, it's okay if they're swingy, right? I mean, like I think about another system, right? So another system that is D20 based, and that would be Dungeon Crawl Classics, which I have videos playing that one, right? So in Dungeon Crawl Classics, there are a lot of tables in that where like a step of one or two in a die can make a qualitative difference in what happens, especially say you look at the spell tables, right? So it's not just you fail, you succeed, as it is, say, for a spell casting you do in Shadow Dark, where it's a roll to cast, but you either succeed or fail. Uh, with the one exception of you could have a terrible failure where you have to do a mishap and that kind of thing, or have to do penance in the case of a priest. Right? So we do have again, just that limited set of like something like 3 or 4 outcomes. That's not the case if you look at Dungeon Crawl Classics. Right, so Dungeon Crawl Classics, you have these enormous pages, right, filled with all the different possible outcomes that can happen based on, well, naturally you could fail, but if you succeed, you succeeded with what number exactly, that is going to end up making a difference. Right, so there is actually a swinginess that comes from the D20 in that system. But that is literally by design. Right? So Dungeon Crawl Classics is trying to be a swingy, unpredictable, random system, right? That is exciting because, right, even if you know what you're trying to do, you don't necessarily know what the outcome is going to be outside of just will I fail or succeed, right? I might have some crazy result, right, that comes about because of what I just did, even if it goes well, right? So that's something by design. It's perfectly fine, right? So, and I think it's also true. Death timers, death is an unpredictable thing, right? So we're trying to capture that unpredictability by using a swingier roll where the number does matter and the number does have that flat distribution. Okay, so just a quick conclusion then. So I'm of the view that rules as written, most D20 systems are not actually swingy, since you consolidate all of these different possible outcomes into basically critical failure, failure, success, critical success. So the swinginess of the D20 really comes from the interpretation, and that this is something that I have seen people habitually doing. So as far as I can tell, right, the books do not give the guideline of, oh, if somebody succeeds and overcomes, right, the target number by 5, right, then that's a lot better than overcoming it by 2. So give them a better outcome. That is not something you typically see given as advice. Right, so where the swinginess comes from then is from us as players or as game masters putting that in, right? So we interpret things that way so that the higher the die says, the better the outcome is, even if by rules as written, that isn't actually in the system. Now, I also want to make the point, is it a problem if you do have the swinginess? Well, as you can see on the screen, it's really up to you. I mean, like sometimes it's fun to play the swingy things, and people do actually like playing Dungeon Crawl Classics. I like playing Dungeon Crawl Classics, right? So I enjoy, right, the randomness of that, and you don't really know what's going to happen. Swinginess can be lots of fun if you want a game with a lot of surprise in it. But on the other hand, right, if the swinginess is a problem in your mind, right, you don't have to do it. Oh, you can just use what I believe is actually the rules as written interpretation of you hit the target number, you succeed. You didn't, you don't succeed. It's a perfectly valid option. It eliminates the swinginess of the D20, and you don't have to go out and buy a million D6 to get a probability distribution. It's really that simple. Right, so I just wanted to share a few thoughts that this come from the statistical perspective. Uh, do with this what you will. Uh, Yeah, I think that's that. All right, so this is Prof E signing off.